So we're beginning our evolution unit, and I wanted to make a screencast that gave an overview of the major principles that kind of explain evolution in the process and how it works. So let's go through. We're going to talk about each one as we go. The first idea is that species change over long periods of time. Now, this is true for the most part. In general, evolution takes a long time. It takes thousands, hundreds of thousands of years. But there are populations in which it can be quicker. We talked about the evolution of dogs happening perhaps even in a human lifetime. There are factors that affect the speed of evolution. First of all, population size. Population size is a huge determination of how fast this is going to go. Is it a large population? If so, it's going to be a slow process because the gene pool doesn't shift as quickly. A small population is going to evolve much quicker. What about the pressures? Is there a great predatory pressure? Are they losing a food source? If those pressures are great, it's going to require organisms to evolve quicker, because if they don't evolve quick, they're not going to make it. And isolation is a huge factor that affects evolution. If a group is isolated, let's say onto an island, we've used the birds as an example. If they're isolated onto an island and they're the founders of a new population, they have all kinds of new pressures, perhaps a new food source, perhaps new predators. They're going to have to evolve if they want to survive in their new environment. The number of species is going to increase. So as things evolve, variation comes about. It's important that we know what it means to be an individual species. And I've got my definition here. It says, in order to be considered of the same species, two organisms they must mate freely while in a free-ranging condition. Free-ranging meaning in the wild. If they met in the wild, they're going to mate. And the offspring that come as a result must be viable and they must be fertile. So they must live, they must survive, and they need to be able to reproduce. We talked in class that there are some problems with this definition. There isn't really a clear-cut definition for what a species is, because obviously there are organisms that aren't considered the same species that will mate and that will produce viable and fertile offspring. We talked about a coy dog. Coyotes and dogs mate. Happens around here all the time. And their offspring are viable and they're fertile. But this is what we're working with. Okay? Speciation is the creation of new species. So as things change over time, new species are formed. So if there's a founder population out on an island, and let's say 20,000 years go by, and you take one of those birds on that island, you pluck them off and you take them back to the mainland, and you introduce them back into that original population, they might have changed so much that they don't even recognize this original population as potential mates, so they're a new species. And going back to variation, there's this idea of form follows function. This is really, really important, not only in science, not only in biology, but also in engineering and other sciences, that your functionality is determined by your form. Obviously, we aren't functional to living in the ocean. We don't have webbed feet and webbed hands. Our function doesn't translate, or our form doesn't translate to functionality in the ocean. Our form translates to functionality on land. If you look at turtles, there are turtles with webbed feet, there are turtles with claws. Their form determines where they live. So if you think about all the different places, all the different varieties of habitats on this earth, your form has to translate to each one. So there's endless different habitats, so there's endless variety in nature. Another principle, all species arose from a common ancestor, the last universal common ancestor. Where's the proof? Well, we've seen fossil evidence. We've seen transitional organisms transitioning onto land with Tiktaalik, the fish that developed front legs and was able to move onto land and get away from predation to fulfill a niche that was open. Archaeopteryx is a transitional form between dinosaurs and birds. Synonyx, a potential transition of the whales back into the ocean. DNA proves common ancestry. We resemble chimpanzees up to about 97-98%, the same DNA. Homologous structures, these are structures that we share, like our limbs. We have one bone followed by two bones and many in the wrist. You see this in all kinds of mammals across the board. Vestigial structures prove relatedness. Why do we have gill slits when we're embryo? Well, it suggests that we have fish ancestors. Why do we have tailbones? It suggests that our ancestors had tails. So these are all different things that suggest common ancestry, and I mentioned the embryological development. Survivors that emerge do so because of natural selection. Natural selection is survival of the fittest. Now, when it talks about being fittest, it doesn't necessarily mean the strongest or the fastest or the tallest. Sometimes it's just the luckiest. Sometimes it's the individual that survived a mass extinction for whatever reason. Okay, maybe they just got lucky. But these ones that survive are the ones that are going to pass on their genes. And ultimately, that's the goal of evolution. And once they do survive, well, it makes sense for many of them to overproduce their offspring. We talked about fish and sea turtles. They overproduce. Why? Because they're not nurturous parents. They don't nurture their young after they're born. After 150 sea turtles hatch, they go out to the ocean and they have to fend for themselves. So the energy investment for that mother is when she's carrying a brood of 150 eggs. It's not afterwards. Okay, she doesn't invest any time after they're born. But as far as humans go, our energy investment is on the back end. When our kids are born, we nurture them. Okay, so we don't have to have 150 offspring. We don't have to overproduce because we take care of our kids generally until adulthood. So we don't have to follow this necessary rule. Okay, and when in cases of overproduction, like in sea turtles and like in fish, that's going to bring about competition. That's going to cause all of these offspring to have to compete for limited commodities, limited food sources. So that brings about the idea of natural selection again. It's those individuals who are the best adapted that are going to survive, that are going to be able to reproduce and pass on their genes, which ultimately is the goal of evolution.